apes and blacks and others, and they weren't sure which was which. There was a lot of discussion about whether orangutans, apes can speak. And they didn't seem to, and there was a lot of debate about why they didn't. And there was a proposal that they didn't call it genes in those days, but there was the analog of a language suppressor gene. Louis Racine, who was the son of the famous dramatist, suggested that apes are really more intelligent than humans. And the proof of it is that they don't speak, because they knew that if they did speak, we would enslave them. So they keep quiet, and this incidentally led to the conclusion that a brilliant father can't have a brilliant son. I was in RLE Building 20 in the Golden Age, and it actually was a golden age, but I got here in 1955. It was quite an exciting place, a lot of enthusiasm, innovation, a very lively interaction among people of widely different fields. It's a kind of community which I think will be very hard, if even possible, to reconstruct. I also have many very warm memories of it. In fact, some of them very hot memories. Those of you who were around in those days may remember that over the summer, Building 20 was unbearably hot. You could barely survive. Morris Halley and I then shared a small office, and we decided we would try to get the Institute to put in an air conditioner, a window air conditioner. So we sent a message up through the bureaucracy, and it finally reached whatever high office it got to, and something came back down to us finally with a message saying, you can't put in an air conditioner because it wouldn't be consistent with the decor of Building 20. Those of you who've ever seen a picture of Building 20 would know what this meant. Fortunately, we could find a friendly janitor who for $10 was willing to break the rules, and we were able to survive the summer. Back a few years earlier, in fact, going back to the time of a famous paper, Alan Turing's paper on machine intelligence, 1950, the early 50s, there was a small group of graduate students down the road who were dissatisfied with the prevailing conceptions of how to understand thought, behavior, language, and so on. And we were trying to see if we can construct another way of looking at these topics, which might be more promising and integrated better into the general sciences. And Turing's comments had a certain resonance. You may recall that in this paper, which is about machine intelligence, he begins by saying that the question whether machines can think is too meaningless to deserve discussion. He didn't explain why, but he presumably meant that it's a question of what kind of metaphor you are willing to accept. So it's like asking, do airplanes really fly, or do submarines really swim? If you want to extend the metaphor, yeah. If not, no. But it's not a factual question. He nevertheless went on to say that it would be a very good idea to construct hard problems to see if you can design machines, meaning hardware and software, to solve them. And the famous proposal of his was what he called his imitation game, later came to be called the Turing test. He thought that might be an incentive to develop better machines, better software. And for that reason, it's good to do it, but we're not asking the machines think. He also suggested that maybe in the course of time, he said 50 years, people will come to, because of this work, people will come to think about thinking in a different way. You can ask whether that's happened. The machines, it certainly was an incentive to develop better machines. And that had a certain analogy to the kinds of things we were concerned with. There is, for one thing, because when you look at language seriously, it wasn't really done at that time, unfortunately, you can see right off that it's what each of us has internalized is some kind of computational system, a system which, in fact, determines an unbounded array of structured expressions, each of which has a dual interpretation. It's interpreted by the sensory motor system as some kind of externalization, sound, or we now know other modalities. And it's interpreted at a internal, roughly speaking, a kind of a thought system called sometimes the conceptual intentional system, as having a specific meaning, which then enters into planning of action and so on. So that's a computational system, and the constant understanding of computational systems had advanced quite considerably by the mid-20th century, in large part because of Turing's work, and that sort of fit naturally. Also, his provisos made some sense for us. There is a standard question, what counts as a language? And I think Turing's response was accurate. The question's too meaningless to deserve discussion for the same reasons as machines thinking. If you want to call the communication systems of hundreds of species of bees language, okay, you can call it that. That means you're accepting a certain metaphor. If you don't want to call it that, don't. It's not a factual question. The facts of the matter are these systems differ radically. Every animal communication system known differs radically in its basic principles, structural principles of use, others, from human language. And human language is, in fact, here it's different from Turing's case, it is, in fact, a particular biological system, one that each of us has internalized, at its core, a computational system with the kind of properties that I mentioned. There's no problem here about constructing hard problems to deal with, because it was quickly discovered as soon as the effort to construct such computational systems was undertaken that almost nothing was understood. Everything you looked at was a puzzle. And the more you learn, the more puzzles you discover. That was kind of surprising at the time, because it was assumed, the prevailing conception was that everything was more or less known. There aren't any real problems about language. It's just a matter of, well, famous version was Van Quine, highly influential philosopher and most influential, whose picture was that language is just a collection of sentences associated with one another and with stimuli by the mechanism of conditioned response. So all there is to do is just trace the individual cases of histories of conditioned response, and you get the answers. Among linguists, it was very widely assumed that languages can differ in virtually any possible way with virtually no constraints. And the only problem in linguistics, I remember this as a student, was to collect more data from a wider variety of languages and apply to them the techniques of analysis which were assumed to be more or less understood, and that's the field. But nothing could be puzzling. On the other hand, as soon as the effort was undertaken to construct an actual computational system with the properties that I mentioned, it was discovered that everything is a puzzle. Nothing is understood. And some of the puzzles are quite simple, and some of them are still outstanding, in fact. So just to be concrete, take the simple sentence, can eagles that fly swim? Okay, we understand it. It means we're asking a question about whether they can swim. We're not asking a question about whether they can fly. But that's a puzzle. Why doesn't the can relate to the closest verb? Why does it relate to the more remote verb, one which in fact is closest in a different sense? It's structurally closest. So similarly, we can say, are eagles that fly swimming? but we can't say are eagles that flying swim. Now that's a reasonable thought. It's asking, is it the case that eagles that are flying swim? But somehow we can't say it. The design of language prevents us from articulating a perfectly fine thought except by paraphrases. And there is a question why that should be true. From a computational point of view, computing the closest verb, computing linear order and linear closeness is far simpler than computing structural closeness, which requires complex assumptions about the structure of the object. So there's a puzzle. The puzzle had been around for thousands of years, except nobody thought it was a puzzle. It's one of innumerably many such cases. I shouldn't mention that in the last couple of years, the sort of a substantial industry has developed to try to deal with it on computational grounds. I won't talk about that. Don't think it gets anywhere. But it's a real puzzle. And furthermore, that principle of using structural distance but not linear distance is all over the place. You find it in structure after structure in all languages, and it seems to just be some universal property of language, and a very puzzling one. Well, discoveries of that kind are kind of reminiscent of the earliest moments of modern science. Go back to, say, 1600. For thousands of years, scientists had been quite satisfied with an explanation for such things as why stones fall down and steam goes up. They're seeking their natural place. End of that story. When Galileo and a few others allowed themselves to be puzzled about that, you start getting modern science. And I think that continues. The capacity to be puzzled about what looks sort of obvious is it's a good property to cultivate. And it's an awakening, and that began at that time. And it turns out there's enormous linguistic evidence that this is the way things work. There's also, in recent years, some evidence from the neurosciences. There's some interesting investigations being carried out by a very good group at Milan. The linguist in the group, Andrea Moro, is well known here. He's been here many times. They've been investigating in the reaction of people to two types of stimuli. One, all new to them, rule systems that meet the conditions, the basic conditions of what's called universal grammar, of the general principles of language, and others that violate these conditions and use things like linear order. So, for example, an invented language in which to negate a sentence, you take the negative word and you put it in the third position in the sentence, let's say. And it turns out that brain activity is quite different in these cases. In the case of a normal language, which the people have never been exposed to, Broca's area, language areas are activated in the normal way. But in the case of linear order, it's not. The language areas don't have the normal activation. People may figure it out, but they're figuring it out as some kind of a puzzle to solve, not using their linguistic capacities. Well, all of this ought to be puzzling, and it is. And in fact, as far as I know, the only serious proposal as to how to explain it has pretty far-reaching conclusions. And the natural assumption is that at the point at which the computations are taking place in the brain, there just is no order. There's no ordering at all. All there is hierarchy. So the only thing the brain can compute is minimal structural distance, because there's no linear order. Well, that looks pretty plausible, in fact, from many points of view. One reason is that if you look at the syntax and semantics of language, for a very broad core class of cases, order doesn't matter. What matters is hierarchy. And furthermore, if you look at so that suggests that one of those two interfaces, the semantic interface with the thought system, just doesn't care about order. On the other hand, the sensory motor system must have some kind of arrangement. depending on what the form of externalization is. If it's speech, it'll be linear order. If it's sign, it'll be various things in parallel. But it has to have some kind of ordering. So it's reasonable to suppose that the ordering is simply a reflex of the externalization, but doesn't enter into the core properties of language, which simply give you the what's used in the thought system. Now that effectively means, if it's correct, and it seems to be that in the informal sense of the term design, no designer, but in the informal sense of the term design, language is designed for thought, not for externalization. Externalization is an ancillary process, and that would mean, incidentally, that communication, which is just a special case of externalization, is an even more ancillary process, contrary to what's widely believed. That has significant implications for the study of evolution of language. I won't go into them, but you can think them through, and for the nature of design of language. Well, there are other kinds of evidence that lead to similar conclusions. It says a lot about the architecture of mind, if this is correct. For example, one class of cases is there's kind of a ubiquitous phenomenon in language of sometimes called displacement. You hear something in one position, but you interpret it somewhere else. So if you say, what did John see? You have to interpret the word what in two positions, where it is, where it's kind of an operator, asking some question about what person or something like that. And also in another position as the object of see, just as in John saw, the book or something, where it's getting its semantic role as the object of the verb. It's got to be interpreted in both positions. It's as if the mind is hearing something like, for which thing X, John saw X, where the for which thing is an operator ranging over the variable. That shows up in other ways. That unpronounced element turns out to really be there for the mental processes that are taking place. You can see that in sentences like, say, they expect to see each other, where the phrase each other is referring back to they. Say the men expect to see each other. On the other hand, if you had another noun in between in the right position, it wouldn't work. So if you say the men expect Mary to see each other, then that somehow breaks it up. Each other can't go back to the men. Well, what about who do the men expect to see each other? Well, that's like the men expect John to see each other. Each other doesn't go back to the men. But there's nothing there in the form that you hear. It's just like the men expect to see each other. Well, that suggests strongly that the mind is actually hearing, interpreting, for which person X, the men expect X to see each other. And that X is like John when you pronounce it. And things like that can get pretty complicated. So if you take a sentence like, say, they think that every artist likes one of his pictures best, like maybe the first one he painted. If you take one of his pictures and you ask a question about it, so which one of his pictures do they expect every artist to like best? The answer would be, well, his first one, even though which of his pictures is not in the right position to be bound by the quantifier every. And that becomes clearer if you make a different question. Suppose you say, which of his pictures convinced the museum that every artist paints flowers? Well, there's no relation between every and his there, though it's structurally, if you think it through, about the same as the one that works. Well, there's really only one plausible interpretation for that, and that is that the phrase, which of his pictures, is actually appearing twice. It's appearing where it's getting its semantic role as the object of like, and it's appearing where it is being interpreted as an operator ranging over the variable. These examples proliferate into pretty complicated cases when you look at them closely. Turns out, interestingly, that all of this follows if you develop an optimal computational system, one that meets the condition of perfect computational efficiency, has the least possible computational operations. Then it turns out that what goes to the mind ought to have all these copies. They don't get erased. On the other hand, what goes to the mouth has them all erased, except for one, tell you that it's there. That turns out to be optimal computation. But that has a consequence. It means that optimal computation, the core of language design, is oriented towards the meaning. The mapping to the transformation change to what comes out of the mouth is causing communicative difficulties. Anyone who's ever worked on a parsing program, trying to figure out how to mechanically interpret what a sentence, structure and meaning of a sentence, knows that one of the hardest problems is what's called filler gap problems. You hear the word what at the beginning of the sentence, and you got to find where is the gap, the unpronounced element that this what is related to. If you pronounce them all, that wouldn't be a problem. Most of the cases would be solved. But efficient computation leads to the consequence that it undermines communicative efficiency. That's pretty much like the case of our eagles that flying, are eagles that flying swim. Nice thought, but you can't say it. Again, optimal operation of the operations is leading to communicative difficulties. And quite generally, there's an interesting class of cases known now where you have conflicts between computational efficiency and communicative efficiency. And computational efficiency wins hands down in every case that's understood, which again suggests that the design of language is really for meaning. It's for semantic and intentional interpretation, how to organize speech acts and so on. And that the externalization of it, the fact that it sort of appears in the outside world somehow, is just a secondary process, communication, tertiary process. Well, that reorients our conception about how the mind works, but it looks pretty plausible. Well, another issue, kind of along, another minute, yeah. Going back to the 50s, it was of course understood right away that none of this it's impossible for any of these things to be learned by association, conditioning, induction, any simple mechanism. So it must be the case that these examples of the kind that I mentioned, which are known very early by children, very little evidence, they must result from the other two possible factors in development. One of them is some genetic endowment, which is a species property. Apparently all humans share essentially the same endowment. No group differences known. So that's one. And the other is just laws of nature. The kinds of laws that determine, say, that a cell divides into spheres, not cubes. No genetics involved, some, but not much. And the interaction of these two factors ought to be able to yield results of this kind. By now there's a fair amount of evidence supporting that. The kinds of things I mentioned illustrate it. Of course, languages differ all over the place. That was known too. So you have to show that these principles that you're postulating are going to apply universally. That does not mean, contrary to a widely held misunderstanding that you can read in journals like Nature, about language that hold universally. In fact, it might turn out there's no descriptive generalizations at all and you have a very rich genetic structure. That's not the case, but it could turn out. Because the things that you see are reflections of internal processes that are going on that meet other conditions, like efficient computation. But it must be somehow you got to apply it to everything. Well, in the 50s, in the golden age, a few languages were studied, the ones that people knew in RLE at that time. Actually, one of the first extensive studies was on an American Indian language, Hidatsa. The first dissertation in the department, actually it was in the EE department because we didn't have a formal department then, it was on Turkish. There was, of course, work on English. Morris Halley was working on Russian. By the 1960s, as the department developed and people came in from all over, the range of languages investigated expanded enormously. In the 80s and since, it's just exploded. There's now intensive investigation of languages of a very wide typological variety, all kinds of new problems being discovered, sometimes new answers, sometimes they lead to further problems and so on. At the same time, what Steve mentioned before, the study of language acquisition really took off. Actually, Steve's work was part of the early work on this in the 80s, based on trying to discover how the options of variation of language, which is all that has to be picked up by a child, the rest is fixed, how those are set on the basis of data, and by now quite a lot of work on that. All of this, I'll just finish by saying, plenty of problems remain. I don't want to overstate, but there's some fairly striking and reasonably plausible conclusions which have far-reaching implications. All of this, however, is restricted to what's going on inside the internal computing system, what's going on inside the mind. Now, somehow language has to be related to the outside world, and because there are two interfaces, it's going to have to be related in two different ways. At the sensory-motor interface, the question is hard, but sort of understood. That's the topic of acoustic and articulatory phonetics, which has been studied pretty intensively at RLE 2 for 60 years, and a lot of results, a lot of problems. But at least the problem's kind of in hand. What about the other end? How does the meaning side relate to the outside world? Well, there is a doctrine that's widely held. It's supposed to give an answer to this. It's sometimes called the referentialist doctrine. It holds that the elementary semantic units, let's say words for simplicity, they relate to the outside world by a relation of reference, picking something out, or denotation for predicates, picking out a class of things. So like cow, the word cow picks out cows, where cows are something that a physicist could identify in principle. The only problem, and that's very widely held, it was known in classical Greece that that's not correct. They didn't have much of a deep analysis, but examples showing it doesn't work. In the 17th century, in the what we ought to call the first cognitive revolution, many of the significant questions were raised that are still puzzling today. It was widely understood that that doesn't work, that as David Hume put it, summarizing a century of inquiry, that the way we categorize things, the things we categorize, he said, are fictitious, created by the mind, using Gestalt properties, notions of cause and effect, notions of psychic continuity for sentient objects. John Locke studied this, and other properties that a physicist cannot identify. They're imposed by the mind on flux of experience. And those are the entities, if you like, sort of mental entities that we construct, and they're somehow related to the world. Now, this poses a huge problem. There's no animal communication system known that has anything remotely like this. There, the referentialist doctrine apparently holds. So if you take, say, cries of a vervet monkey, each cry is keyed to some identifiable physical event. You know, like leaves are moving, we interpret that as meaning an eagle's coming, all the vervets run and hide. I don't know how they interpret it is another question, but or else it's an internal sort of hormonal phenomenon, like I'm hungry or something like that. Every communication system that's known works like that. But human language doesn't work like that at all. You take a look at the words of the language, none of them work like that. And that's a real problem. For one thing, it's a tremendous evolutionary problem. Like, where did all this come from? Totally unknown and maybe unknowable. But it's also a problem for the nature of language and for the acquisition of language. Like, how do children find these properties which they get to understand very quickly? In fact, things like children's fairy tales exploit them effectively. Well, these are major mysteries that remain on the horizon, right at the core of what language and thought are about. And there are plenty of other ones, so I just suggest again that the capacity to be puzzled is a good one to cultivate.